Welcome to Conrad Grebel University College. My name is Karen Sunabaka, and I have mixed European and Métis heritage. And I come from Treaty 1 territory, specifically from the Red River Settlement in what is now known as Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Selkirk, Manitoba. I work and reside here in Waterloo on the traditional territory of the Attawandaran, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo and Conrad Grebel University College are also situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land granted in 1784 to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. We are standing near the Grebel Garden, a place where we are publicly acknowledging that the land on which the college sits, as well as much of Kitchener and Waterloo, was supposed to support the Six Nations in perpetuity. The following is quoted from this plaque in the garden. As buyers and sellers, Mennonites were, and are, implicated in a larger process of Indigenous dispossession, end quote. This plaque represents one of many steps we are taking in a long journey towards better relationships with Indigenous peoples.
My name is Marlene Epp, and I too welcome you to Conrad Grebel University College. I have Mennonite heritage. I grew up on Treaty 1 territory and now work and live on the Haldimand Tract. In May 2022, 1 year from now, we will host Indigenous-Mennonite encounters in time and place, a gathering of body, mind, and spirit. This academic conference and community education gathering will offer stories and analyses of encounters and relationships between Indigenous peoples and Mennonite settlers from their first encounter to the present and all around the world. This preview video will give you glimpses into that gathering a year from now. You can submit a proposal on our website or just come and learn. We hope you will join us.
My name is Amy Smoke, and I am Mohawk Nation Turtle Clan. I'm from the Six Nations of the Grand River. I'm the current manager at Sidijirota, the Waterloo Indigenous Student Center, and I'm one of the co-founders and organizers of Land Back Camp 2020. We'd like to welcome you here today. I'm looking at Conrad Grebel in St. Paul's here at the University of Waterloo. We are on the Haldimand Tract. And as an Ongohongwe Haudenosaunee person, I'd like to offer a little bit more of an acknowledgement of the land. The Ohandu Garawandekwa is literally translated as the words that come before all else, the preliminary matters, the most important words. And before we begin all things, we want to acknowledge and greet all of the things in creation that we should have humility for, that we should be grateful for, that we don't often acknowledge every day. So I'd like to begin in my language. Anska and the Wahway Nuni ne Angwatnigura, Dahnu Dietinu Hurarune, Yadi Nistaha Owanja, Mother Earth, Atoni and Duhakne and Gwatnigura. Aguigo Anska and the Wahway Nuni ne Angwatnigura, Dahnu Dietinu Hurarune, Gaitsua, the berries, Atoni and Duhakne and Gwatnigura. Aguigo Anska and the Wahway Nuni ne Angwatnigura, Dahnu Dietinu Hurarune, Gundirio, the four-leggeds. Atoni and Duhakne and Gwatnigura. Aguigo Anska and the Wahway Nuni and Gwatnigura, Dahnu Dietinu Hurarune Ganegarunya, the water. Atoni and Duhakne and Gwatnigura. Aguigo Anska and the Wahway Nuni and Gwatnigura, Dahnu Dichirwane Hurarune Songwayandisa, creator. Atoni and Duhakne and Gwatnigura. Ona Noa, Atoni Oreji Wagwani, Doga, Otana, Siwagani Aha, Ize and Gorahana, Neganawana Dosra. Ato Nikawanagi Dana Ona Ato. And what I said there at the end, that if I didn't say something, I leave that to you to honor or acknowledge or greet in your own way. and together our minds are circled as one. Also, as a First Nations person, we like to open our events with song. And as a Mohawk person here on these lands, I would like to sing the Mohawk Friendship Song, a song we sing in order to extend friendship to all of the guests, all of the settlers, all of the folks here on our lands today. Thank you.
Okay, Scano Seguego, Ige Teotando, Nyawago Singwandiso, Sungwawi Ganyo Hanyo. Welcome to the Grand River Territory. My name's Fran Davis. I introduce myself in my traditional language, which is Cayuga, and I use my Ongwe Homwe name, which means rites of passage. It's the end of the field before the forest. And I brought today my children with me, 4 of my children that are going to sing and dance for us. But before we start that, we're going to open up in a traditional Haudenosaunee way. And I said a bit of a small prayer at the beginning. I just said, thank you, Creator, for giving us things to be thankful for. And I also said, you know, just acknowledging people, because it's going to take all the people that, with all their efforts and all their capacities to do this reconciliation work that the country is moving towards. So my son here, Jacob, is going to do a little longer version of our prayer, what's called the Ganyo Hanyo in our language. It means the words that come before all else, because those words help to lift our minds to a good place, a place of appreciation and gratitude and optimism. So the reason why we do this is, like I said, to bring our minds to a good place, to bring our minds together, to be thankful. And they say when we get to that powerful mind of that good mind, then we will do great things together. So what Jacob's going to talk about is, he's going to say in our language, he's going to talk about some of the things in creation and about the things that they do for us. And so after he talks about something, for example, the trees, and he talks about how the trees provide, so much for us. They give us fresh air. They filter out the bad air. They, have sometimes give us fruit, or they give us wood so we can build our houses, and we can build fires to cook our food. And you could go on about the different things that the trees do for us. And then at the end of his acknowledgement, he's going to say, now our minds are one. And that's where we're taught to just be thankful, put everything else aside for the moment, put all our worries, responsibilities, stresses in life, just put them aside for a moment and just be grateful at that moment for whatever he has referred to. So I'm going to let Jacob do our Ganyo Hanyo and in our language in Cayuga. So now you have a bit of context of what he's talking about, so you can imagine in your mind how he's acknowledging different things in creation. So, Jacob.
Dan and Dan against God dance for Tonsio, Skyway go water, ne enjoy a canto, so going decent, so go Ganyo Hanyo, Dane do a choy ne Wednesday, Etisa, Etino Hunqua, ne to Ganyoto, Watney Goha, Dane and do a choy ne Sconedayo, ne to Ganyoto, Watney Goha, Dane and do a choy ne Gani Hanyo, Hadicha Soha, Eoki Edo, ne to Ganyoto, Watney Goha. Dane and do a choy ne Squay decent, so go Ganyo Hanyo, ne to Ganyoto, Watney Goha, Dani taught the God Queenie, Eget, Nagayato, Ganyo Hanyo, Dani taught.
So you heard Jacob say, he would say that one part, Eto no yaduhage ne ngwat nigura. And that means, or he didn't say that, I said that in Mohawk. He was talking to Cayuga. But anyways, that's the part that says, now we're going to put our minds together. So we're going to share some singing and dancing. And I thought what would be the best thing to share for this time is what we call the Eskanye Gainase, and it's the New Woman Shuffle Dance. And what it represents is the Sky Woman, massaging the dirt into the back of the turtle. And she did this at the beginning when she came down from the sky world. And she did this to spread the dirt around as much as she could, and she sang and she prayed as she was doing this. We got a visitor. But anyways, so so what the girls are going to do is they're going to dance the Skanya Gainase, and the guys are going to sing for them. And this is to honor all the women, because in our society, we're a matrilineal society, and our men hold our women in a high esteem because they're life givers, right? So my sons, Jacob, who you met, and my son Corey, will be singing some Eskanye, Gainase, and my daughters Joni and Jade will be dancing for us. Keep filming them.
Yano, Hawa,
we're just going to conclude at this time. For our Mennonite and Indigenous conference, we will be joining at the next year at the event, and we will be doing other songs and dances. But I think we're going to give you an example of one more of our dances, and I think we'll do a smoke dance, which is a very fast and fun song, and it originates from our war dances. And dancing. So with that, I guess we're going to end it here again. My name is Fran Davis. These are my sons, Corey and Jacob, and my daughters, Joni and Jade. So thank you very much.
Tansei nitotamak, Laurie Campbell and Itzikasun, Equania Two-Spirit, Nehio, Abitago Saskanaskoil. Hello and welcome, my friends. My name is Laurie Campbell, and I am a Two-Spirit Cree Métis woman from Treaty 6 territory in northern Saskatchewan. Although I have lived and worked here on the Haldimand Tract for the last 4 years, the territory I am from traditionally belongs to Indigenous groups that are very different than the Indigenous groups here. Saskatchewan is home to the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis peoples. Like the lands of my ancestors in Treaty 6 territory, I recognize that these particular lands have always been the source of learning for Indigenous peoples here, and I am committed to respecting the traditional knowledge that they have derived from these lands and to learning from their experiences on them. I am an intergenerational survivor of the Indian residential school system and a child from the 60 Scoop generation. Over the span of 25 years, I managed to locate and contact not only my birth mom, but all 6 of my living siblings that had been scattered throughout several provinces in the nation more broadly known as Canada. Over 20 years ago, the History of Indigenous-Mennonite Relations Conference was held in Manitoba. Some of you may remember or may have been at that conference. My auntie, Elder Laurie Campbell, was a keynote speaker at that event. She shared a story of 2 wonderful old women who were an important part of her early years. One of them was her Cookum, my great-grandmother, and the other was the Cookum's friend, an old woman known simply as the Mrs. Cookum was a midwife and a healer, and Auntie only knew the Mrs. as one of her grandmother's friends that provided assistance to Cookum. Cookum and her relatives were removed from their home territory around the North Saskatchewan River, a place where our family had lived for as long as they could remember. They were removed because the federal government decided to turn the territory into a national park in the early 1900s. Indigenous families in the area were relocated to a place known as Ngiwin, which means the stopping place in our Cree language. Permanent homesteads were being developed on the good land, while the Métis families that had been displaced were living on the road allowances. Eventually, a post office went up, and Ngiwin became called Park Valley. This is where Cookum and the Mrs. met. Auntie had asked her father one day why they had only called the old woman the Mrs., to which her father replied, "I don't know what her name was. That is just what her old man always called her." What Auntie didn't know at the time was that the Mrs. was Mennonite. What my auntie shared at that conference back in 2000 was a story of these two old women, Cookham and the Mrs., and how both understood in their own ways what it was like to be erased and made invisible. I share my story with you to situate myself, to provide the context for who I am and where I am from. I also want you to know that my story is not one about trauma, victimization, and pain, but rather I carry the stories of Indigenous survival and the undeniable strength of my ancestors. Know that my story doesn't define me, but it does tell you the lens through which I experience the world, both as someone who has been researched and someone who is a researcher. I once asked my auntie, "How do you say research in our language?" And she said, "We don't have a word for that, and rather that what I seek is a reclaiming and learning that is deeply complex and complicated, painful and joyful, but ultimately a wonderful way of searching, and that when I find a little piece of knowledge, I will know because it is gentle, like a warm, soft wind, and often it has no words." I hope you will join me at the 2022 Indigenous-Mennonite Encounters in Time and Place conference as I share more stories of research centered from a two-spirit, Nehio, Apitego Sasanaskwayo.
Indigenous resurgence movements challenge immigrants and settlers to confront our presence on colonized lands and to transform our relations with Indigenous peoples and with land. We are being asked to rethink pioneer logics and settler common sense. That is, the assumptions we have made about whose land it is, how we see possession, and our histories in relation to Indigenous dispossession and elimination. I find it intriguing that participation in what was actually a violent but slow process did not figure as violent or problematic for Mennonites. And this leads me to ask what processes enfolded Mennonites within the settler colonial order that was being created in Canada. How did Mennonites move from being immigrants to settlers? And more narrowly, how did this process work within Treaty 1 territory? My name is Raina Neufeld, and I'm a Mennonite, and some of my ancestors arrived in Canada as early as the 1870s, settling in an area that became known as the West Reserve in Manitoba. Russian Mennonites formed the first group of immigrants to arrive and settle en masse on dedicated immigrant reserves in that fledgling province of Manitoba in 1874, after they'd scouted out the area in 1873, which in itself was 2 years after Treaty 1 was signed. Motivating me in my research are questions of accountability today. To what do we, or I, need to account for as descendants of these settlers? How do we even think about responsibility or accountability when we are removed by several generations? And even then, the Mennonites who arrived were not government officials or military actors. My forebears, they were early settlers, they were farmers, and not everyone succeeded. Many moved to other areas of Canada, including myself. I'm here on the Haldimand Tract. To help wade through this quagmire, I use memory scholar Michael Rothberg's work on implicated subjects. To quote Rothberg, implicated subjects occupy positions aligned with power and privilege without being themselves agents of harm. They contribute to, they inhabit, inherit, or benefit from regimes of domination, but they do not originate or control such regimes. An implicated subject is neither a victim nor a perpetrator, but rather a participant in histories and social formations that generate the positions of victim and perpetrator. I find applying this lens of implicated subjects to Mennonites helps to recognize varying forms of involvement in processes of domination in Canada. And I think this helps us move beyond blaming distant papal bulls or political structures. A short example to help illustrate what this thinking looks like. Mennonites arrived in the midst of the Dominion of Canada, creating sovereign land claims based on what scholar Eva McKay terms fantasies of entitlement. That is, the colonial rationales and supposedly legal frameworks for asserting and justifying control over the land. This included ensuring English versions of treaties papered over evidence that Indigenous negotiators consistently agreed to an alliance with the Queen and then a sibling relationship with the Dominion of Canada when it was opening land for settlers. In the 1870s, Mennonites were invited then to join what Lord Dufferin called a war waged against the brute forces of nature. It was a war of ambition in which Mennonites were not called upon in the struggle to stain your hands with human blood, but rather they could join as farmers who broke ground and helped the prairie bloom. You can hear that within this process, the landscape becomes the opponent or the oppressor rather than the British or the settlers. And as Gunpul scholar Aileen Moreton Robinson observes, it's the landscape then that must be conquered, claimed, and named, and not Indigenous people, who at the level of the subconscious are perceived to be part of the landscape and thus not human. So Russian Mennonites, my ancestors included, arrived in Manitoba helping root these narratives and the logic of possession of the land. There's a lot more to the story. It involves racial hierarchies that get entwined with economic and political processes, as well as everyday practices. It's in the details, when we look at them, that we can actually see how the processes of being an implicated subject work. My aim with the research is to better understand ways in which Mennonites as a community find ourselves in this gray zone of implication that's over time and space, and a history we need to be accountable for. It's this careful historical accounting that's an important part of what Indigenous scholars and educators like Cherokee Professor Jeff Corntassel have invited settlers to in living in a longer now, connecting past and future generational responsibilities to enter into relationships of constructive solidarity. It's hard but necessary work. I hope you will come and join us for the Indigenous-Mennonite Encounters event in 2022 to help further explore past, present, and future. Thank you for listening.
Three years ago, a pastor friend was digging around in his office for communion wine, apparently for official purposes, when he came across a set of intriguing files from the late 70s that referenced a church statement on energy and the environment. He posted a picture of these typed documents on social media, and immediately it piqued my interest. For you see, many of us at the time were trying to raise awareness of the Line 3 pipeline, a Canadian energy project that was being built through the prairies, down into the Dakotas, through Minnesota, and into Wisconsin. An energy project that seeks to move almost 800,000 barrels of oil a day, an energy project that's being resisted by many Indigenous peoples, a deadly project that's just pouring fuel on the fire of our climate emergency. For some reason, my gut told me that this old church resolution on energy might offer a word to our current context. So I quickly texted my friend to see if he had a copy of the resolution. And within minutes, I received a link at Anabaptist Wiki, where I found the 1977 General Conference Statement on Christian Stewardship. And I was blown away by what I read. More than 40 years ago, our church promised to live lives of energy simplicity. No surprise there. But get this, they also committed to push the powers of state and industry away from fossil fuels and nuclear energy towards solar, wind, and biomass. If that's not all, our relatives in the faith also called for a moratorium on a controversial pipeline project that ran from the Yukon down into the States, the Mckinsey Valley Pipeline. They called halt on that pipeline because it threatened the environment, but also because it violated Indigenous rights. the Dene peoples had not given their consent. Our Mennonite church publicly opposing pipelines in 1977. Our Mennonite church publicly promising support for Indigenous rights and land claims in 1977. Amazing stuff. This was news to me. I came to Winnipeg back in 2011 to work as Mennonite Church Canada's Indigenous Settler Relations Director. At that time, it was called Native Ministry. At that time, I had a lot less hair. When I stepped into this office, I was aware of 4 critical commitments that the denomination and MCC had been a part of. There was a powerful 1970 confession that the church offered to Indigenous partners. There was the 1987 New Covenant ecumenical commitment, which promises support for Aboriginal self-government. There was the 1992 MCC statement on the quincentenary of Columbus, which vowed our support for the just fulfillment of outstanding land claims. And there was the 2010 resolution that acknowledged Mennonite church complicity in the residential school system. 4 important corporate statements. But that's it. I wasn't aware of anything else. Yet this 1977 energy resolution got my mind churning. What else had the church publicly confessed in its relationship with Indigenous peoples that I wasn't aware of? Confessions that we've forgotten, confessions that the church needs to remember and live into. Not long later, I found myself in the Mennonite Heritage Archives, scanning microfiche, thumbing through conference yearbooks, and flipping through Native Concerns files. Within hours, I had found a number of church commitments on Indigenous justice. And although I knew that this was something I should have done years ago, I felt deep joy. We were rediscovering, in my mind, holy words crafted by elders in our community, words written in the context of deep relationship with Indigenous peoples, words written for the most part in response to Indigenous calls, words that were trying to get the rest of the church on board, words that our churches and faith orgs, often to surprise, publicly resolved to uphold. Many of these words were breathtaking. So I approached Ruth Plett at MCC and talked to her about the possibility of collaborating on a project. We need to get these lost covenants for Indigenous justice back into the hearts of Mennonite people. Ruth agreed. Initially, we thought we could do a small booklet, but there was just way too much material. We kept on finding stuff that was so important to share. Soon, we invited historian Esther Eptison, former public engagement coordinator with MCC, to co-edit a book project, and thus Be It Resolved came into being, an anthology of some 50 years worth of church resolutions, organizational statements, parliamentary submissions, and calls to action in support of Indigenous people's struggles for well-being. Last night, I was listening to an old interview with a favorite person of mine, Dan Berrigan, the Jesuit poet and activist, whose life of radical discipleship has impacted so many. Berrigan reflects in that interview on statements that the Catholic Church has made on important matters like war, conscientious objection, poverty, race relations, and he finds them wanting. These statements, says Berrigan, have a very limited appeal. The first question should be how we are living our lives, not what we are advising others, like the church or government, to do. I'd like to see the church, Berrigan advises, a little more modest in that way. Let's act if the gospel were true, and it might come true. Now, Mennonites, broadly speaking, pride ourselves in being a modest people, a people whose words don't run too far ahead of our embodied actions. And yet the story that Be It Resolved shares is one that does challenge that modest testimony. We've got work to do, collective work that requires much organizing, commitment, and risk for us to catch up to those words that are ahead of us, those spoken long ago. But I believe we can do it. I won't make a public promise to that effect, but I believe, and I pray that it will be.
Hello, I'm standing in the gallery at Conrad Grebel University College. Here in 2022, we plan to exhibit archival materials that illustrate encounters between Indigenous and Mennonite peoples. Behind me on permanent display is a quilt by fiber artist Judy Gasho-Yutzi that illustrates Mennonite and Indigenous presences along the Grand River. You may recognize it from its image on our conference website. I've called my presentation From Footnote to Front Page, because that is the journey archives are on. Archival theorists and practitioners, along with historians and other scholars, are thinking about the archive as source and seat of power. Examining archives as instruments of repression and colonialism, as well as resources for truth-telling and healing, repositions archives from neutral footnote to center of scrutiny. Documents such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and, in Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action are infused with ideas around history, memory, and record-keeping that are at the heart of archival work. Archives have a crucial role to play in getting at the truth part of truth and reconciliation. What has happened, how it has happened, and why. The archival community in Canada is examining our role in decolonizing minds and hearts. A recent report makes recommendations on ways to decolonize archives, including cultivating respectful relationships, creating welcoming spaces, re-evaluating organizational culture, examining access and ownership of materials, and paying closer attention to how materials are described and arranged. In short, these recommendations are an invitation to examine every aspect of archival practice. I recently completed a project for the Mennonite Archival Information Database to survey subject headings used for Indigenous peoples and set the database on a path to more accurate and welcoming language. Through this project, I became more aware of the complexities of identifying and addressing problematic language. I am especially grateful for the expertise shared by Indigenous archivists, memory keepers, and researchers who are working in many ways at restoring what Native American literature scholar Drew Lopenzina calls the longhouse of the archive, a space of vision and memory, narrative and tradition. Indigenous peoples have rich archival traditions. As Ojibwe chief Shikwakan said to colonial officials in 1852, "We beg of you to believe what we say, for though we cannot put down our thoughts on paper as you, our wampums and the records of our old men are as undying as your writings, and do not deceive." The chief's words get at the heart of what an archives is and should be. Archives require trust. An archives is formed by a community and does not grow or thrive without it. A healthy community and a healthy archives are linked. Settler archives and their communities remain unhealthy when not engaged with truth and reconciliation. Every once in a while, I see a news headline about a discovery of something hidden in the archives. In my experience, archival discoveries are not necessarily headline events. They happen every day. As each new generation of researchers ask new questions of the archives, different aspects of those archives are revealed, and assumptions are contested. As Indigenous researcher Sean Wilson says, we should see research as a ceremony meant to build stronger relationships, to bridge the distance between aspects of our cosmos and ourselves. How can Mennonite archives and our communities better support relational research and build trust and community with Indigenous peoples? Perhaps this is something we can talk about when we meet.
Wache, ane, bujo, tego. I'm Kiwe Finwe Inone from the people of the Mushkegowuk, Fox Lake Reserve, Chapeau Cree First Nation, and I am a beautiful person. And my other name is Clarence Kakagi. And this fine gentleman right here is
Seth Ratzlaff. Hello, nice to meet you.
that I'm part of the 60 scoop. I was displaced along with my sister. My reserve is up in Chapleau, and I ended up in the region of Kitchener-Waterloo. And I'm standing on the land where I was brought up for 13 years. And that land was owned by New Order Mennonites. So I stayed with a New Order Mennonite family for 13 years, and then through conversation, I found out that Seth was actually Mennonite from Niagara. That's from Niagara. So, you know, the more time Seth and I spent together, there's a lot more similarities that come from that, and I consider Seth my brother. He's like my younger brother.
So we're doing this video to introduce a project that Clarence and I have been working on ever since we met, which was in 2000 and
I think 2015.
yeah, I think it was 2015.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a little bit about that? How it all got started?
Yeah, for sure. That would be an honor. Over the years, once I started to find out who I am, why I am, and what my purpose is in life, and I started finding my direction, there was numerous people that I would meet, and they say, Clarence, man, your story is very powerful, and if you can, I would encourage you to try to write a book. And I always thought about that, and I am not a writer by any means, shape, or form. But what I do is I tell a story of my life and the way it was, what happened, and what it's like today. So it was when I was at Worth a Second Look in Kitchener, and I was doing some work, and I was looking for some furniture for an individual I was supporting that was moving in to a new apartment. And while I was in there looking for a couch, I made the acquaintance of this young man who was we didn't know each other from a hole in the ground, but our spirits connected right off the bat. And you know, we started having some small talk, some conversation about what I did. Seth was obviously managing the store at that time, and I said, if you want to find out what I do, why don't you come with me for a day or an afternoon and shadow me, and I can show you what I do in the community. That's when I was working for the House of Friendship, and I was an intensive shelter to housing support worker. So Seth and I, we picked a date, the two of us got together, and I think you spent the day or the afternoon with me. And during that time that we spent together, we started to have conversation about my life, you know, who I was, where I was brought up. And it makes me feel so good just to be connected back to this land, because if there was any time in my life where I found solace, where I found peace, where I found comfort, it was actually out on the land. And there's lots of stories that are connected to this bridge and to this land. So through conversation that day, I found out that Seth, he had an English degree.
That's right.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden a light bulb went off in my head. And I thought, well, you know what? Maybe this guy could be the man that is going to help me put my story on paper and to get it out to the masses. That was my hope, anyways. So I had some tobacco, and I offered Seth a tobacco tie, and I gave him a tie just like this. And then when he took it, then I shared with him the teachings of taking tobacco. And pretty much once you receive tobacco, you're obligated to help that person. So I think I was a bit hasty on just trying to find somebody, and I should have given the teaching first. Regardless, it all worked out, and Seth and I, we embarked on a journey together to start putting together this book.
When Clarence asked me to get started on this project, or asked me to help him write his story, I think at that time in my life, I was only just starting to become aware of my identity as a settler in my own implication and colonization and oppression of Indigenous peoples. So really, when I said yes, when I took the tobacco tie, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And it has been, I think we'll both agree, it's been quite the journey.
It has been one heck of a journey.
And we're quite close to the finish line now. COVID threw us a curveball. There's been lots of learning along the way, and there's still a lot of learning to do. Certainly, I'm glad that we embarked on this journey.
Mm-hmm. I think the journey has connected us as spirits.
If you want to know the story about the Alder Creek Bridge, read the book, which hopefully will be available at the conference.
Yes, there's lots of stuff that I really want to share, that we want to share, but we also want to encourage you to read the book, because the book not only has information about my life, the book has information about the relationship with the Indigenous people and the Mennonites. It has so much information about our community and our region.
Sego, Sewagwego, Amy Smoke Youngits, Kenyankahega Ni'i. I'm Mohawk Nation Turtle Clan. I'm from the Six Nations of the Grand River. I'm the current manager at Sadidarota Waterloo Indigenous Student Center, and I was one of the founders and am a current organizer at Land Back Camp in both Victoria Park and Waterloo Park in 2020.
My name is Hannah Enns. I am a Russian Mennonite settler on this land, originally from Coast Salish territory in Victoria, but moved to Kitchener-Waterloo in 2012 for school, where I studied peace and conflict studies like any good Mennonite would. Came to Conrad Grebel because of the place it holds within the Mennonite circles, and then while a student studying peace and conflict there, met Amy Smoke at the center, the Indigenous Student Center over at St. Paul's.
We've done so much in the front lines, I think, throughout the years that we've known each other, and in particular, the Waterloo Indigenous Student Center being at St. Paul's next to Conrad Grebel. We've worked in a number of different spaces together, and I think that's also really important too, is that both of the institutions we are part of and affiliated with also do really great work together.
For me, my role in Land Back Camp as a white settler, as a Mennonite as well, on this land here in Kitchener-Waterloo, that is, there's a lot of Mennonite violence here that's happened on this land. But for me, what is most important is the relationship that I have with Amy and Sean and other community members and organizers, and it's out of those relationships that have had many years to form and change and grow, that any type of meaningful solidarity comes out of those relationships for me.
Sure, right? And that's huge important. The relationship that was, fostered over years between Sean even and myself and Hannah, and in some of the work we've been doing across the community, that can take years, right? That collaborative work, the trust, and it's because of, for me, a lot of the Mennonite connections to land, their relationship to land. Coincidentally enough, maybe not so coincidentally enough, the space turned into a very queer space with Indigenous and settler, trans, non-binary youth, two-spirit. It was a very gender diverse community, and we often talk about how that's not really it's not really a question anymore, that intersectionality of queerness and on the ground activism work is done by folks who have that identity. So I think it was really important too that Hannah be a part of like a queer space, working on the land together like that.
Yeah, and it's taken me many years to come into my own queer identity,
Right.
and I think that's also because growing up Mennonite, and I won't be afraid to name that, and then as such, as a queer person, to be able to witness and be a part of in a supportive role land back camp, and the beauty and the magnitude of power that can come out of a queer and two-spirit specifically led space has been amazingly beautiful.
I remember a couple times too, and part of it is you know, having queer youth, two-spirit youth in a space where they had never actually said the words, I'm a queer person, I'm a two-spirit person. And for us, for some of the Indigenous organizers, having folks around us like Hannah, like Rainbow Reels, folks allowed for us to be able to have those moments, for us to be able to hold that space, because they hold that space for us as well. Yeah, having youth say for the first time I'm a queer person, transformational. That's really transformational work that needs to continue.
Stories are so important. They are important in all races and cultures the world over. Stories tell us who we are, where we came from, tell us how to live, and what is important. Each person hearing a story will hear something different and will hear it differently each time a story is told. Stories can be happy, sad, and funny. Stories can also be hard to hear, but all stories hold much knowledge and learning. Sometimes we have to look for the purpose or the meaning in a story, but all stories have something to take away. We all have stories. For some of us, stories are not easy to tell. For me, my story has remained unspoken for most of my life. In my early years, I grew up in a conservative Mennonite community. My Mennonite roots and name were often spoken about and celebrated. What was not spoken about in my presence was the Indigenous roots of our family. There are still many pieces of that puzzle that are lost or faded. Part of my journey is to try and find those pieces if at all possible. As a little girl, deep down, I never really felt like I belonged. I could not put it into words, but I felt different. I felt like there was a piece of me that was missing. I remember at a young age, adults questioning who I was and where I came from. When I was 5 years old, 3 Ojibwe boys from Northern Ontario came to join our family. Many people thought I was their blood sibling. I was treated differently at school. I was looked at through a different lens when we went outside our community. I felt a bond with my brothers by heart. When we went north to visit my grandparents and take my brothers home for a visit, running around the reserve with the other children felt normal. No one questioned my presence. I felt a sense of belonging with these people that looked like me. Racial slurs started at a young age. Some of the comments came from people close to me. They hurt. Why did they say those things? When I was in my early 20s, I asked a few relatives some questions. I was told in no uncertain terms to leave the past alone. I still have many of those same questions. I remember questioning to myself, what were they hiding? Why did they not want me to know? My Indigenous teachers have told me on many occasions, your blood memory knows who you are. You don't need papers to tell you that. Trust that. Trust is difficult for me because of my life experiences. Trusting that I know my Indigenous ancestors and who they are. The ones that I feel deep inside. The ones whose blood runs through my veins, the ones who have given me knowledge that I was not taught, is very hard because we live in a society that wants to see the paperwork. I have kept much of my story secret for fear of not being believed, fear of hurting others because it is not an easy story. It is not the typical Mennonite girl story. Or maybe it is more typical than anyone wants to admit because many people have kept their stories a secret. Reverend Paul Martin once told me that it is important to tell my story, that it may help others know that they are not alone and give them the chance to tell their story. Bit by bit, in small groups or individually, pieces of my story are finding a voice. My hope is that each one of us finds a space, a safe place to tell our version of our story. Now wait for listening, all my relations.
Dirksen. I am a cellist and a composer. I also happen to be half Cree and half Mennonite, which I like to refer to as a Creenanite. I come from Treaty 8, Northern Alberta. On my dad's side, it's North Tall Cree Reserve. And on my mom's side, it's Buffalo Head Hills, Lacrete. I'm sure some of you would know where that is. I am super thrilled to be creating a new choral piece for you in the coming year, and also I'm really looking forward to hanging out. I don't really get to hang out with a lot of other folks who have this lineage, so it's gonna be super fun. Thanks again for having me. Peace, and stay safe until I see you again.